well. Okay, so we are in Revelation chapter 18, and Revelation chapter 17 was a description of how that Rome is pictured as a great harlot. And so an angel comes and describes for John the items that we began to see in the last part of Revelation 16, specifically the pouring out of the seventh bowl. And so we have in Revelation 17 again the description that is portrayed to us. Rome is pictured as a harlot. Also, she is pictured as Babylon, like the Babylon of the Old Testament, and the nation that persecuted God's people when they took Judah into captivity. So there's a lot of different ways that Rome is being portrayed in a symbolic way in the book of Revelation. So after describing the harlot and the meaning of those items in a brief way in Revelation 17, there is the announcement in Revelation 18 of the fall of this great harlot. And so we saw last time in our study, for example, in Revelation 18 verses 1 and 2, after these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. We mentioned how that actually there are three things that are towards the end. It's actually, as the New American Standard, Legacy Standard Bible have it, a prison of every unclean spirit, a prison of every unclean bird, and a prison of every unclean and hateful beast. And so we see that there's that announcement, and that's the main thing I wanted to look at. In verse 2, there's the announcement. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Obviously, the ancient Babylon had long been fallen by this time, so he's using Babylon as a symbol. Then we saw in verses 5 and 6, or I should say verses 4 and 5, there was this need for God's people to come out and away from and to separate themselves from Rome and the influence of Rome, the great harlot, and not be wrapped up into the sinfulness of the empire like so many in the world had. And so there's this pronouncement of judgment then in verses 6 and through 8 about how that not only would she be repaid for her sinfulness, but be repaid with interest. Pay her back double is the idea in verse 6. Repay her double according to her works. And so there is that, again, reminder that God would judge the wickedness of the empire because of how Rome treated his people. Then there's three groups of people that we see are going to be tremendously affected when Rome would fall. The first is the kings that had their alliances with Rome, verses 9 and 10. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. So again, you have that blending of the figures of the kings have committed fornication with her spiritually. They had engaged in idolatry and so forth. So there's the harlot imagery. And then it is that great city Babylon, verse 10. So there's the Babylon imagery. So again, we have a lot of the mixture of the idea of ancient Babylon portrayed, or is being used symbolically to portray Rome's wickedness, and then the harlot aspect being used to portray Rome's wickedness. But the kings of the earth, those that had alliances, those that had, submitted themselves under the authority of Rome and so forth, they are the first ones, the first group that is mentioned as mourning over the loss of Rome. Babylon, the harlot, as it's described. So now we pick up in verses 11 through 14, and we'll see another group of people that are affected. And so verses 9 and 10 was the lament of kings. these are going to be the lament of merchants in verses 11 through 14, and really it goes all the way down to verse 17, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So let's read verses 11 through 14 of Revelation 18. It says, "And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble." Verse 13, "And cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men. The fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all." So, I mentioned here in the notes, probably on your page 128, it's 127 in mine, it says, I mentioned here, although verses 11 through 17a, or the very first part of 17, deal with the merchants, we sectioned off verses 11 through 14 as a complete thought, and then verses 15 through the remainder of those verses, the 17a, as a complete thought. So just to know, yes, it's going to continue to talk about the merchants in verse 15 to verse 17, but we're going to talk about some specific ideas in verses 11 through 14. So these verses inform us, the merchants then, that had profited greatly by having their trade go on with Rome, they were going to weep over Rome's destruction because they no longer can make a lot of money. Rome, that had been a great trading partner and so forth, and being able to sell their wares into the various folks that were associated with Rome, well, that economy for them is going to go away when Rome, the empire, is then overthrown. Now, these verses also list the merchandise that these merchants sold, as we just mentioned a moment ago, I should say. And it's interesting when you look at these verses, I have in the notes that much of these verses are comparable to what happened to the ancient city of Tyre. And so if you go over to Ezekiel 27, you can see that there's some Old Testament allusion to this. And so we see a lot of the Old Testament, especially quotations and references and allusions from the Old Testament in Revelation chapter 18. So in Ezekiel 27, beginning in verse 27, you read these words: "Your riches, wares, and merchandise, your mariners and pilots, your caulkers and merchandisers, all your men of war who are in you, and the entire company which is in your midst, will fall into the midst of the seas on the day of your ruin. The common land will shake at the sound of the cry of your pilots. All who handle the oar, the mariners, all the pilots of the sea, will come down from their ships and stand on the shore. They will make their voice heard because of you. They will cry bitterly and cast dust on their heads. They will roll about in ashes. They will shave themselves completely bald because of you, gird themselves with sackcloth, and weep for you with bitterness of heart and bitter wailing. In their wailing for you, they will take up a lamentation and lament for you. What city is like Tyre, destroyed in the midst of the sea? When your wares went out by sea, you satisfied many people. You enriched the kings of the earth with your many luxury goods and your merchandise. But you are broken by the seas and the depths of the waters. Your merchandise and the entire company will fall in your midst. All the inhabitants of the isles will be astonished at you. Their kings will be greatly afraid, and their countenance will be troubled. The merchants among the peoples will hiss at you. You will become a horror and no more forever." So there's a lot parallel there. You have these three groups again. You have the kings talked about. You have the merchants talked about. We will see the mariners later in Revelation 18. But you see the mariners are mentioned in verse 29. So all the same groups of three people that are mentioned in Revelation 18, and the goods that they brought, and the way that they traded with Tyre and used Tyre as a way to, buy and sell and so forth, very similar to the imagery that we have in Revelation chapter 18. And so this is, again, a helpful passage, I think, because it shows how God has consistently punished wicked cities, nations, and so forth by looking at an Old Testament example and allusion of this. All right, so back to Revelation 18. In verse 11, the merchants of the earth are now predicted as weeping and mourning over Rome's destruction. And what is the reason? For no one buys their merchandise anymore. That's what it says in the last part of verse 11. Verses 12 through 13 lists the merchandise that is bought and sold in Rome, and I divided those up for you in the notes as far as the categories. For example, there are precious metals that were being peddled and sold, gold and silver. There are precious stones and pearls, it says. There are also expensive fabrics that were brought and sold there, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet. There are materials used to make furniture, decorative items. It says every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble. Instead of citron wood, the English Standard Version says scented wood. The Christian Standard Bible, instead of citron wood, says fragrant wood products. Now, when I saw citron, I thought of citronella candles. That's what I was thinking of. So, anyway, it's interesting how this is, these scented woods were being sold there as well. There are sweet-smelling items sold by the merchants. In verse 13, it says, and cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense. There are harvested items that are sold, mentioned, such as wine and oil, fine flour, and wheat. There are desirable animals for both food and transportation. You have cattle and sheep, horses and chariots. And finally, although it doesn't specifically say it, we gather that these are a reference to slaves, bodies and souls of men. And now I reference also Ezekiel 27:13 is a similar idea expressed in Ezekiel 27:13. If you go back to verse 12, it says, Tarshish was your merchant because of your many luxury goods. They gave you silver, iron, tin, and lead for your goods. And this is still talking about Tyre, by the way. And then in verse 13 it says, Javan, Tubal, and Meshach were your traders. They bartered human lives and vessels of bronze for your merchandise. So there's the idea of, it was a slave trade in Rome. And there was, I don't remember what the figure was, citizens to slaves. There was more slaves in Rome than there were citizens. And so it's no surprise that this is spoken of here as well. Now, William Barclay, in his commentary, gives a lengthy but helpful quotation of Aristides, who describes the various kinds of merchandise that freely came to Rome. It's very interesting. If you read it before class, you might have thought, wow, that's interesting. But look at what it says. Yours is probably on page 129. Merchandise is brought from every land and sea. This is Aristides, the quotation Barclay has from Aristides from ancient times. Merchandise is brought from every land and sea. Everything that every season begets and every country produces, the products of rivers and lakes, the arts of the Greeks and the barbarians, so that if anyone were to wish to see all these things, he would either have to visit the whole inhabited world to see them, or visit Rome. That's quite a bit of stuff. So many great ships arrive from all over the world at every hour, at every season, that Rome is like some common factory of the world. For you may see such great cargoes from the Indies, or if you wish, from the blessed Arabias, that you might well conjecture that the trees there have been stripped naked. Clothing from Babylon, ornaments from the barbarian lands, everything flows to Rome. Merchandise, cargoes, the products of the land, the emptying of the mines, the product of every art that is and has been. Everything is begotten and everything that grows. If there is anything you cannot see at Rome, then it is a thing which does not exist and which never existed. All roads lead to Rome. That old saying. Well, that's basically the picture that you have. Everybody was coming to Rome, trading in Rome, and had a lot of different experiences from just all the melting pot that was there in Rome. And so very much aligns with what John is describing to us in Revelation 18, verses 11 to 14, as far as the merchants and their goods are concerned. Now, verse 14 gives a sense of finality to all of the profits and benefits that these merchants enjoyed. It says, the fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you. So the fruit of their labors is gone. Continues. And all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you. So the luxurious living that they had come to expect and enjoy, that comes to an end. You shall find them no more at all. They won't be found anywhere else. Because again, if, like the quotation there by Aristides, by Barclay, if you didn't find it at Rome, it just didn't exist. And so with the end of Rome comes the end of the rich, luxurious lifestyle that they enjoyed. And so Summers notes something I have at the bottom of the page, probably 129, your notes. He says, second, so the first thing he talked about, of course, was the kings, like we talked about. But he says, second, the merchants of the earth lament over her destruction because now they have no market for their merchandise. There are about 30 articles of trade mentioned here in the text. To create such a business, the merchants have entered into the evil of the empire. Now they fall with her. Nothing can be economically good if it is morally bad. So there you have the first description of the merchants lamenting over the fall of Rome and with it their livelihood. Then in verses 15 through 17, he continues to talk about the merchants. He says, the merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. So really, that ends the first part of verse 17. Remember, chapters and verses were added much later in our Bibles, so they don't always, weren't always cut off maybe where we would think they should be. But that would cut off the whole of the merchants by the first part of verse 17. So much like the kings of the earth stand at a distance for fear of her torment, back in verse 9 it said that they were standing and seeing the smoke of her burning. Well, these merchants also do the same thing. The benefits of the relationship between the merchants and Rome are quite clear. They became rich by her in verse 15. The benefits of the relationship, when Rome is destroyed, then causes them to start weeping and wailing, as he says in the latter part of verse 15. And so, they've lost everything. They've lost their livelihood. They've lost their income when Rome is finally put down. Furthermore, according to verses 16 to the first part of verse 17, they are pictured as commenting on Rome's downfall, saying, alas, alas, that great city. Now, that great city is a phrase that we've seen describing this picture all along. We saw it back in Revelation 14 and verse 8. And another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city. And then we saw it again in chapter 17, verse 18. And the woman whom you saw is that great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. So again, the city is portrayed as that great woman, or that woman, I should say, the harlot. So again, it makes it clear that Babylon is supposed to, and the harlot are used interchangeably. The wealth of the city is portrayed as being clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. Well, that was the exact same description. The city is portrayed here as being adorned with that. Well, back in Revelation 17, verse 4, the harlot is portrayed with those same items. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, in Revelation 17:4, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. So, the attire of the harlot is pictured as the attire of the city. So again, all of it's symbolism. All of it is figurative. Can't have a literal city with literal clothing on or literal, jewelry on. So again, it is meant to portray something to the reader. Then with the beginning of verse 17, there is the astonishment of the merchants that was shared by the kings of the earth in verse 10. For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. And then back in verse 10 of Revelation 18 with regard to the kings, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. So there's that repetition of that, for in 1 hour, for in 1 hour. So again, we mentioned last time, you think about how long Rome had been in existence, at least according to legend, with the Romulus-Remus idea of, Rome was supposedly created by these two figures, and it's a legend and so forth. But the point is, given its long history as compared to how quick the empire fell, it's like, boom, quicker than it took for it to build. Well, obviously, it took a long time to build this empire, but it didn't take long for it to be judged by God. And so that's what we see with regard to the merchants. Any questions, comments, observations up to the first part of verse 17? Okay, so let's look at the last group of people that are being affected by this. You had the kings, first of all, then you have the merchants, and then finally you have the sea folks that make their living on the sea. Verse 17, the middle part, every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what is like this great city? They threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing and saying, alas, alas, that great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. So, now we have those who are involved in the importing and exporting by moving on. Actually, I just need to read my notes. I'm trying to summarize. I wrote, the last part of verse 17 highlights the final group financially affected by Rome's downfall, those involved in importing and exporting. So the shipmasters, the sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, like the merchants, they're going to lose their livelihood. As with the other two groups, they likewise stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning. So those that profited, again, the shipmasters, the sailors, they profited from their relationship. They can't do anything either but stand back and watch it fall. Like I mentioned, like watching a train wreck, right? The old saying, you can't, it's like you want to watch it, but you don't want to watch it. They're concerned about Rome as far as they're concerned, and they're profiting and their livelihood. So they hate to see that, but then they can't believe their eyes, and so they continue to watch as the empire is crumbling before their eyes. While they stand at a distance, they are crying out, what is like this great city? There's that phrase again, that great city keeps coming up in the text. So it's clear that these shipmasters and sailors had put their trust in Rome instead of the true and living God. Again, we have some Old Testament reference here to Ezekiel 27. I believe that was one of the passages that we read earlier. Yes, it was. In their wailing for you, they will take up a lamentation and lament for you. What cities like Tyre destroyed in the midst of the sea? As a sign of grief, they are pictured in verse 19 as throwing dust on their heads as they continue their weeping and wailing. And again, that sounds a lot like the sailors' response toward the city of Tyre in Ezekiel 27. Verse 29 of that chapter that we read a few moments ago as well, all who handle the oar, the mariners, all the pilots of the sea, that will be the sailors, just like in Revelation 18, will come down from their ships and stand on the shore. They will make their voice heard because of you. They will cry bitterly and cast dust on their heads. They will roll about in ashes. They will shave themselves completely bald because of you, gird themselves with sackcloth and weep for you with bitterness of heart and bitter wailings. Again, nothing new to see here as far as the imagery. These are ways that God has historically used to punish people and show the reaction of a fall of a city or a nation. So, it's truly, as I mentioned here in the notes, it's truly a prophetic picture when men trust in the power of their government or their nation instead of trusting in the true and living God. Daniel noted in Daniel 4 verse 17, this decision is by the decree of the watchers and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. Very similar parts of that are also found in Daniel chapter 4 verse 32, later on in Daniel 4. So again, the folly in all of these folks, the kings, the merchants, and the mariners, trusting in Rome and its ability to provide for them rather than trusting in God's ability to provide. So that finishes the section of the three groups that are clearly affected by Rome's downfall. Any comments, questions, observations from the text here? So the number three, remember there's symbolism in numbers. So we have three groups, again, kings, merchants, and the sailors or mariners. Shows a completeness, much like the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the number three, representing completeness. Now we see in verse 20, there's another three in contrast to the three that are mentioned, the kings, merchants, and mariners. Notice what it says in Revelation 18:20, New King James Version. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Now, there are some ancient manuscripts in the New King James Version. One of the things I love about the New King James Version is very, most often, frequently, I think it tries to do its best to talk about some of these alternate manuscripts. And so there's a footnote for Revelation 18:20 in the New King James. It says that certain texts also read saints. And so the New American Standard and other translations have verse 20 rendered this way. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets. There's the three. Because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. So it makes sense for the three in verse 20, if saints is to be included, which would be all Christians in the first century here mentioned, it would make sense that there would be the three righteous to balance the three groups of people that are unrighteous. So, while the wicked weep, the righteous rejoice. The kings, the mariners, the merchants, they're all the wicked folks that are benefiting from Rome. The righteous are suffering because of Rome. And so, they're not unhappy with the fall of the empire, because with the fall of the empire goes the fall of the persecution that they are facing. And so justice prevails because God is in control, and he will punish those who persecute his people. So remember, back in Revelation chapter 6, verse 10, the souls under the altar, those that have been beheaded, in other words, the suffering saints, were crying out, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" Well, here they have their question God will punish the wicked Romans who have persecuted them. And so in Deuteronomy 32, verse 43, rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants and render vengeance to his adversaries. He will provide atonement for his land and his people. And so for that reason, the wonderful words, encouraging words of Revelation 18:20, I would select as the key verse to the chapter in Revelation 18. As I mentioned, I would try to give you a key verse for every chapter. This would be especially encouraging and comforting for the Christians, the 7 churches of Asia that John is writing to. All right, then we can close out the chapter, verses 21 to 24 of Revelation 18, and you'll see the silencing of the city described. Verse 21 of Revelation 18, then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found any more. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you anymore. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you anymore, and the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore, and the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all nations were deceived. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and all who were slain on the earth. So in verse 21, we're told that a mighty angel, much like we've seen before, a mighty angel, shows a very forceful and final picture of Rome's overthrow. So it's pictured as him taking up a great millstone and throwing it into the sea to symbolize the sinking of what is referred to as Babylon, which again symbolically we think is no doubt a reference to Rome. And so this action signifies that with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down. Furthermore, as we would expect a stone to sink straight to the bottom and be seen no more, so too the city shall not be found anymore, as it says in verse 21. The very last phrase, shall not be found anymore. I mentioned here in the notes, on page probably 132 in your notes, given that this millstone was described as a great millstone, it would have probably been one that required a donkey to turn it, and unlike the kind a woman could turn. Over in Matthew 18:6, remember Jesus said something about a millstone being put around somebody's neck, and it would be better if they had that done. In Matthew 18, verse 6, but whoever causes one of these little ones, children in the context, who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Pretty blunt statement there about people who cause one of his little ones to stumble. And so there you have the figure of a millstone once again being used to cause something, or in that case, someone to sink. Now these words in Revelation 18 verse 21 are especially reminiscent of Jeremiah's experience. And I mentioned it here in the notes in Jeremiah 51 verse 63 to 64. Now it shall be when you have finished reading this book that you shall tie a stone to it and throw it out into the Euphrates. Then you shall say, thus Babylon shall sink and not rise from the catastrophe that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. So in actual Babylon, ancient Babylon, there was that imagery of a stone being thrown and sinking, much like Rome, figurative Babylon, also by this millstone being thrown and its sinking as well. So again, more Old Testament allusion and reference that John is using. So again, nothing new to see here either. Verse 22 then continues the dismal aftermath of Rome's destruction, in which silence is the only sound that will be heard. Verse 22, the sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you anymore. So, although the wealthy Romans would have enjoyed the sounds of all this music playing and enjoy it very much, that's going to stop, obviously, if Rome ceases. That stuff, that joy that's portrayed in the playing of music would cease. Also, there would not be craftsmen or women grinding at the mill any longer. So there would not be the sound of workers and laborers going on in Rome. Verse 23 completes the picture with a sense of darkness and a lack of joy. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore. So darkness is portrayed. And the voice of the bridegroom and the bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. So there would not be so much as a lamp to light any place in the city, or at least that's how it's portrayed here symbolically. The kind of joy that would be celebrated at the joining of a bride and a groom would cease to exist. Even though the merchants of Rome were great, their profits came as a result of wickedness and deception, as it's stated here. Now, again, going back to Jeremiah, similar events were said of Judah and its wickedness. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light lamp. I mean, almost identical to what is portrayed here in Revelation when God was punishing a wicked people, his own people in that text in Jeremiah 25, when they were going to go to Babylonian captivity. Ray Summers in his book, Behold the Lamb, sums up verses 22 to 23 by suggesting, verse 22, you have the amusement life going away. You have the business life going away. And then you have home life, bride, bridegroom, and so forth, going away. So all of these different areas of life go away, of course, when the empire goes away as well. And then finally, verse 24, the greatest wickedness of Rome is expressed, and in her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all who were slain on the earth. So once again, it's the blood of prophets and saints, as we saw Revelation 6. Again, those who were crying out on the altar, and other kinds of bloodshed that made Rome a perfect candidate for God's wrath. So you see, chapter 18 is really a dismal, dark picture of a city and an empire that failed to retain God in their knowledge, like Paul portrayed in Romans 1:28. They didn't like to retain God in their knowledge. That's what led to all the idolatry and the wickedness described in Romans chapter 1, talking about the Gentile lifestyle. And obviously the Romans were Gentiles. So they bought into that Gentile lifestyle that's described in the letter that's written to the Romans in Romans chapter 1. And so they are pictured as being destroyed. And yet Summers writes something that may be on the minds of many people when he's describing the end of Rome and the destruction of Rome. Summers writes this: she was destroyed. The blood of the martyrs stands as an eternal testimony against Rome and to the loyalty of the Christians. Those who oppose this method of interpretation point out the fact that Rome still stands. That is true, but it's not the persecuting Rome of John's day. That Rome is dead. A combination of many things brought an end to that Rome long ago. The Christian movement, which that Rome tried to stamp out, still stands and will stand when all other quote-unquote Romes have fallen to decay, even as that ancient Rome fell. And so you really do have that picture of Daniel chapter 2 being fulfilled here, when remember that the image, the great image that Daniel interprets with the statue, the head of gold and brass and iron and clay and so forth. And so in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, get over there, you have these words as a reminder. And in the days of these kings, well, these kings again was that fourth kingdom that would have historically been Rome, as you read up the description prior to that. In the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So the days of these kings, the Roman kings, in the context of Daniel 2, that's what we have being fulfilled once Rome is put down. God's kingdom, the church, still is standing today. Questions or comments on chapter 18? All right. We're willing, we'll pick up with chapter 19 next time. Again, the song of invitation is 907. We know the persecution of Christians continues still today. Thankfully, it's not like the persecution that we read about in the book of Revelation. We don't have people being lined up and slaughtered, thankfully, in this country like they did in ancient Rome. Christians tossed to the lions, given over to the Colosseum, the arena, and being killed like they were. But we know that nevertheless there is the persecution of Christians still going on today. And so again, we are comforted by the words that God will win in the end, as again the message of Revelation as a whole reminds us. To him who overcomes, to him who overcomes. And all the promises associated with that. But again, we have to be those who are his people. He had urged his people in Revelation chapter 18, verse 4 and 5, you need to come out away from them. You need to get out from the world, stay away from the influence of the world, Rome in particular in that case. And likewise, we know the church itself is made up of those who are called out of the world, as the word that is translated as church means. Ecclesia, they're called out of the world and away from that. And they're called out, of course, by the gospel. 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 14, by which I called you, Paul says, by my gospel. You were called by my gospel, he says. So we know the gospel calls us to be obedient. It calls us out away from our sinfulness and our sinful lifestyles, being obedient to God so that we can receive the wonderful promises that he gives to those who overcome even in our day. And so tonight, if being a faithful Christian is not something that describes you, Jesus invites you to be that, to come and receive his forgiveness. If you are a Christian who has sin in your life, to repent of that sin, Acts 8:22, confess it. 1 John 1:9, his blood will continue to cleanse you. But if you've never become a Christian through faith, repentance, confession, and baptism, Jesus wants you to do that. And we want to help you do that. And so we invite you to come, if we can help you tonight in any way, as we stand and sing this invitation song.
Hark, the voice of Jesus calleth tenderly upon your ear. Sweet his triumph, love, and dignity calleth. Turn and listen, stay and hear. Ye that labor and love heavy laden lean upon your dear Lord's
Reminder that there's more supper left prepared for those who need to partake who did it this morning in the classroom to my left. Any further announcements before we close tonight? Remember Miss Jessie's visitation, of course, and funeral tomorrow. If not, Kenneth, would you close us out?
Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. Lord, we thank you for this another opportunity to assemble in thy house, to learn more of your word. We pray, Father, that you'll bless those that are sick. We pray that you'll give them back to as much of their health in according to your will. Pray, Father, that you'll go with us as we leave this building. Pray that you'll forgive us for our many sins. In Christ's name, amen.
Oh, you got it. Yeah.